This is everything I need for the next stage of the basing on this. A selection of paintbrushes, which are in our little dragon pot. Video on that in the playlist. I've got some coarse, I think this is glass. It can be difficult to glue this one down, and the way it reacts with superglue makes me think it's probably crushed glass. It's quite good as a coarse sort of gravel. Weirdly, if you use actual gravel, it doesn't always look the right scale. Got some fine sand. And I've already applied a layer of sand texture gel. I don't use this stuff very often, and I'm still kind of experimenting with it and figuring out how it works. Biggest nuisance with this is it usually takes 24 hours to dry if you're using any quantity, and I've already put some of that on the base. You can sculpt it a little bit, so you can build up the layers. I'm hoping it will also double up as a glue to hold these other substrates down. If not, I've got some PVA glue which I can use afterwards, which is usually quite effective.
We're going to start this next stage with the sand texture gel. It doesn't really look like much of anything. The sand texture in it is very fine, and I'm going to be applying this with just an old chisel tip brush. It does wash out fairly well, but I don't want to use a nice brush for this just in case. I'm going to be adding the gel just where the rock meets the floor and using it as an adhesive for the crushed glass. And I just put some on like this, and then sprinkle the glass on, give it a little bit of a press down with the spoon, because I notice that sometimes the glass just falls off if you don't. Tap it off into the box, and then just using that other worn out brush there, just sweep off any of the excess glass, because it does seem to just stick with static, whether there's glue there or not. And then the first thing you know that it's not stuck properly is when you paint and it pings off onto your brush, which is a bit irritating. Just working my way around anywhere it looks like the join between the floor and the rock isn't quite as smooth as I'd like. Anywhere I feel that, you know, it would benefit from a little bit of this gravelly scatter. For the pathway up to the steps, I'm not actually adding any glass at all. I want to use sand there. I want it to look more like it's been well travelled, like they've been walking back and forth on that. And now we'll use that paste just to fill in some gaps where I want the sand, and it also helps blend out the glass because it will go in between those gaps where the glass is too chunky, and just help again blend everything out, covering most of the base but not all of it. So some of that first layer of the texture gel is still there, and that will make more sense later. A few little dots over the rocks. There is some gravelly bits moulded in, but they're a bit soft, and I wanted something that looked a bit more like actual grit and gravel. And also I'm going to use some of that to turn into grass later, because scale modelling is weird like that. Set that aside to dry. That will take a little bit of time because that texture paste doesn't dry the quickest, and I gave it a fresh coat of white primer just to unify everything again. I was fairly light on the middle of the base. I didn't want to obscure details, so mostly focusing on those bits that we've actually put back in there. And we're going to start with some moot green. This is the nearest thing Citadel do these days to a goblin green, and this works for how I'm building this particular collection, because I'm collecting beastmen and centaurs, and I want them to be in sort of a very lush, sort of late spring, early summer kind of an environment. Maybe as if they've just arrived there, maybe as if that's just the universe they're in. Using an old chisel brush and doing quite a rough job with this. I don't want any hard lines. I want where the grass ends and the gravel begins to be just a little bit blurred. And I'm using where I've put the sand and the gravel on the base as my rough guide for where things go. Just paint a few bits upon the rock there where we put extra sand. Just define that path a little bit more. I'm not too worried about this being a very even coat. In some ways it being a slightly uneven coat will be better later. XV88 next, and that's going to mostly be for the path. I don't want it to look like a properly laid path with rocks and paving slabs. I want it to look more like it's been walked in. And I'm also going to use this brown on the upper faces of all of the rock, all of the gravel. This will make sense in a bit as we start building up the layers, because I want it to look like that path is the natural substrate on here, and as a result you're going to expect some of those colours in the rocks in the environment, because, well, that's where your substrate's coming from in part. So the brown will go sort of blotchily all over the top surfaces of the rocks. I'm going to keep away from most of the underside and most of the shadowed areas because, well, I don't want this colour there. And you can see I've done it down the middle of the steps there where you would walk the most. Baraknar Burgundy next. This is a very bright colour over the white, and you are going to have to trust the process here because it's going to look pretty bad in a minute. I'm going after all of the darker areas, the downward facing parts of the rocks, and I'm being a lot more liberal with this than I was with the brown. This is what I think of as underpainting. So this is going to set some colours and tones that would be very hard to put in with the later phases that we're doing, but it's very important that it's oversaturated and kind of too bright for what I want to get in the end. I'm going to avoid those two platforms, one with a hole where one hoof sits and then the other one with that big design on it, because I want those to look more worn. And I'm avoiding the tops as much as I can. I'm going to have to take some of it round because, well, you need to for what happens later. But yeah, this looks about as bad as it could look. This is the part of the painting process where you mustn't second guess yourself. You must just keep going. You need to do this stage. Things need to look bad because otherwise the next stages won't work. Deathguard Green next. This is like a pale olive drab colour. I'm applying it very thin and I'm just essentially filling in all those white gaps. The brown and the purple aren't quite dry, but that's okay because that's going to help me do some rough wet blending on the surface, and again that's going to stop the very hard colour transitions, which I don't want here. I want everything to have a sort of natural look. I want everything to be slightly blended but not so far that it's just a blurry brown blob. But as this green goes on, you can start to see why I've chosen the colours I've chosen before. That purple's not looking quite so bad now, and that brown's not looking quite as brown as it was. In fact, it's heading more towards an orange than the brown we started with. I'm not going over any of the moot green. I want that to stay really, really bright. Again, that will make more sense later. And I'm not trying to get every single speck of white paint covered. We've got some things to deal with that in just a moment. I'm going to have to leave this to dry before we do the next stage. You can see it shaping up. You can see how that's starting to look like an actual rock now. We're all dry and we are using some Drakenhof Nightshade. This is a lovely navy blue wash. I'm not being very heavy with this. I want this to be a unifying coat, so I'm trying to use it more like a glaze than a wash. Also, I don't want to have to wait for another 24 hours for this whole thing to dry. I don't need a lot of this blue. This is really just to pull all of those various tones together. So it's going to desaturate the reds in that purple and the brown, and it's going to pull the yellow out of that green and just bring everything closer in line with each other. Sort of desaturate things a bit, darken things a bit, and it's going to fill in all of those awkward gaps that were difficult to get to with the paintbrush before. Again, I'm avoiding those flat platforms. I don't want those desaturated as much into this blue. We're going to do something slightly different there. And I'm avoiding those green splodges of lichen or moss or whatever we're pretending it is on the top of the base there. Go all over the steps, and we're not leaving that to dry. We're going to move straight on to Athonian Camo Shade. I don't mind if these two washes blur together a little bit. So I'm starting from an area where there isn't the blue wash and then working out towards it with the green. This will help keep the two colours distinct, but it'll also blur them together like in the gravel where you would expect a jumble of plant life and detritus and rocks to exist. being fairly liberal with this over the green, and you can see how much it's toning that moot green down now, so it's not quite so neon as it was. I've gone over the path completely with this because I want it to look a little bit like there might be some, tiny bits of grass in there. And now we need to set that aside to dry, which is, the most tedious part of the painting process. And here we are. Both of those washes are quite flat, which is nice, so I can see a lot more clearly what I'm doing. And it's pulled all of these colours a lot closer to what you would see in sort of a slate landscape. Eshin Grey is our next choice. And this is where the magic happens. Using a nice soft dry brush from Army Painter. I'm not sponsored, I just like these brushes, they're really good. Load up some of that Eshin Grey and be fairly liberal with it. I'm going over most of the upward facing areas, but again I'm avoiding those two platforms a little bit. Don't want to go too far into the shadows on this big sticky out rock. And already you can see how much that's changed the colour of the rock without getting rid of all of that work that we did underneath. And this is how you get that look where like the surface of a rock has dried out. Dawnstone next, this has a slightly lilac tint to it, so that's going to tie in with that very strong purple that we used a while ago. Being a lot more sparing with this than the Eshin Grey and just chasing the very high points on everything. I'm going to avoid the moot green areas, just going to go after the rocks with this one. And again, you can see just how much that pulls all the tones together and unifies it without making it look like just one colour. Karak Stone. I want to put a little bit of warmth in just these two platforms here, and I'm going to use a tiny bit of it just dotted around like on the path there, just wherever I feel it needs just a little bit of warmth putting back in. Maybe it's the grey looks a bit too plasticky, that sort of thing. You'll figure out what works best for you on your particular project if you're using this to help you figure out how to paint some rocky stuff. But yeah, I'm really happy with that. Back to Moot Green. I'm just checking that's what it said on it, as if I need to. I don't really have another green that's quite like this one. And I'm just going to stipple here rather than dry brush. I'm adding a little bit of sort of algal growth, moss, that sort of thing over the rocks. I don't want this to look too clean. I want it to look like it's fairly natural and semi-neglected, as if the users of it don't really care about it being clean. Just got to be careful I don't go too far. I don't want the rock to turn completely green. I still want it to look like a rock. XV88 again. I do like this brown, it's very versatile. This time though we're picking out the bones. I'm not trying to get into every single recess, I just want to pick out the majority of the visible surfaces on here. We'll do those very deep recesses later. I also want the bones to look more like, if you've ever watched any archaeology television and seen skeletons dug up, I want the bones to look like that. So once that's done, we take some Karak Stone and just highlight the very high points of all the bones. I'm not trying to be very precise here. I'm being as precise as I need to be, so I'm not spilling over all the rocks, but just enough to pick out the details on the bones. I don't want them to look clean. I want them to look like they've been here for a good long while and they're surrounded by, soil and dirt and whatever else has collected while they've just been dumped there. They have that look of just being sort of deposited and left rather than arranged carefully. And I want to lean into that. I'm going to put a little bit on this tree over here. I went back and forth with this tree as I was doing the rest of it. It feels a bit out of place to me. Anyway, Rhinox Hide next, and this is for that totem. I finally decided what I was going to do with it. It's sculpted in a similar way to Kragnos's armour, so I thought after having done the rest of the base I'll lean into that. So we'll start with a Rhinox Hide base colour, but I want this to look like it's been here a lot longer, which is why I'm not using the same bronze recipe as I did on him. And yeah, I could have gone kind of nuts with the detail on it, but I think it made more sense not to on the base. And that's why we're going for Sycorac Bronze next. But first, while that Rhinox Hide dries, I noticed there were these little dots sculpted into that base, and they looked to me like metal pegs that have been driven in. So that's what I went for. And you can see I'm doing the Sycorax bronze over the totem after the Rhinoxide had dried. Being fairly loose with it, don't have to be too careful. And while the metallic dries, we're going to go for Temple Guard blue. I'm still trying to figure out what I'm doing with what I'm thinking of as the magical elements of the base. Now the reason for the Temple Guard blue is it's a good magic energy colour, if you like, but it's also a colour that isn't used anywhere else on this model, on the base or on Kragnos, so it's going to stand out that much more because of it. It's not going to stand out so much that it overpowers the scene, but it's enough that it jumps out proportionally, if you like. Now painting this crack was a little bit of a nuisance because of the way it's sculpted, and I was going back and forth with my finger and a wet brush and the paint, and I noticed as I was doing it that very slight blurring I was getting was actually what I was after. So just kept going. Sometimes the best tool in your kit is your fingers, and if it works what you're doing, use them. I was quite happy with how this was building up, but it just stopped at the ground, which I wasn't so keen on, so I spread out some magical energy detritus from that, and with more of that watered down Temple Guard blue, I'm just going over these carved details on whatever this design is, dabbing it off with a kitchen towel. My finger was a bit too aggressive at taking the paint off, and just loading a little bit more in the middle, as if maybe it's glowing from the middle out to the edge, but keeping the paint thin so that the stone shows through afterwards. And then just to finish, a very, very light dusting of the Sycorax bronze, just so it catches the light occasionally. It's very subtle, it doesn't pick up on camera tremendously well, but it does in person catch the light and draw your eye to those areas. Agrax Earthshade again, and we're going to go back to those bones, being a lot more deliberate in application now. I just want to get the very deep recesses. I don't want to wash over them completely. Just, again, to give them that sort of been there a while, dingy look, as if they're very old bones. And I shan't be highlighting those up further than that. That's where we will leave those, and that will actually work quite well. Also dotting around anywhere that I feel like it needs a bit extra shadow on the base. Sometimes you need to put a little bit more emphasis into particular areas if it's feeling like it's gone a little bit flat. That's one of those things. You can go back and forth a bit with your various colours until you get the finish that you want. And this is pretty much the finish that I want. We'll have to leave that alone to dry again because it's a wash. But that's okay. It's looking really good. I'm really happy with it. Now for some extra scenery. This is green sawdust flock, and these are some flock flowers. I've not used these before. Using a slightly nicer chisel tip brush, just dabbing on some watered down PVA wherever I want that green sawdust flock to go. I'm being a bit selective about where it goes. I want it to be sort of on the edge between the bright green grass and the gravel, but I don't want it to spill over onto either, so it's more sort of like a boundary plant life of some sort. You sprinkle it on with a spoon over your tub, and then using some tweezers we pull off some of these flock flowers. They're very easy to use. The hardest thing about them is getting them off the sheet, and I found the tweezers were the best way to do that, and it also made them easier to manipulate on the base itself. No real plan here, I'm just looking at where I feel like a splash of colour would work, and I don't want to overload it, I don't want to go too mad, but there's a lot of space to cover, so I could do quite a few clumps on here. And of course you can cut these down, make them smaller if you wanted smaller clumps, but I think the big ones actually work quite well on this base, given what else we've got going on with it. A little bit more moot green. The edges just need lifting up a little bit. It helps blend in that sawdust flock as well. I'm using a scruffy old brush, not quite dry brushing. And Nihilak Oxide, which is one of the Games Workshop technical paints. It's really good for doing a verdigris finish. And since this is bronze, doing it rusty wouldn't make much sense. but giving it verdigris definitely does. So quite liberal, splodging it around on the base a little bit there, and that looks quite nice. And here is the finished article. I went back and tweaked a few bits and pieces here and there, and gave it a final coat of varnish, which does look very shiny on those rocks, but they are sculpted very shiny. I'm very pleased with the end result. It's a good model all on its own, just that base. But with Kragnos on, it looks even better. I like that he's not too out of place on this base. Those red flowers help tie him in a little bit better. And I like that the base is very different to Kragnos' colour schemes without being something that looks like it's from a different model. So the end result is very cohesive and I'm very pleased with it. It looks great on the shelf. I am glad I spent the time I did on this one. I hope you like the end result too. I hope that some of the things I've covered here have been useful for your own miniature painting adventures. It's taken me a long time to get through this model, but I'm glad I've done it. Thank you very much for watching, and don't forget to check the description box below. There's details on how to support the channel down there. I do have a Patreon and I do have a Ko-fi account. Our next craft video is going to be quite different, so if you don't want to miss out on that, obviously do a subscribe. And I'll hopefully see you all next time. Bye for now.